Well, hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Terri Cole Show. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. I'm so excited that you're here. So, I got an email from someone that made me laugh a little bit, so I decided to call this episode How to Avoid Getting into Relationships with Narcissists and Psychos. So, I know that's very long, it's not that catchy, but that's literally what this woman wrote in. Can you give me one thing that I can do to be rest assured that I will not get into another relationship with a narcissist or a psychopath? Well, that is a really tall order. That bar is very high. I don't know that I can do that, but I did come up with what I thought would be helpful. So this is for you. So it has to do with personal boundaries, which you know I love to talk about. But in all of our relationships, right, our personal boundaries, how healthy they are, really do dictate how healthy our relationships are. So this has everything to do with this person's question. So let's talk about what is it that we need to know to avoid getting into relationships, and really for so many people being trapped. If you've ever been in a relationship with a narcissist, then you know what a terrifying experience it is and how incredibly difficult it is if you get sucked back in to actually get out of that relationship. And with someone who is unhealthy, even if they're more of a psycho and less of a narc, it doesn't matter. Either way, it's an unhealthy situation to be in. So personal boundaries encompass a whole wide, broad spectrum of internal experiences that we have, right? And the internal experience informs what kind of an external boundary, like what action is appropriate, basically. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to learn to negotiate for our needs, for our desires. And what does this require of us? We have to understand the difference between these things that are all a part of drawing boundaries, but I'm going to get specific about what they are. So you need to know the difference between a preference, a demand, a judgment, and the non-negotiable deal breakers. That's probably the most important one, referring to someone who doesn't want to get involved with another relationship with a psycho, is the non-negotiable deal breakers. Because part of the thing is this: if you have the disease to please, if you come from a long background of being taught to please others, if you're a high-functioning codependent that I talk about quite a bit on this show, then I want to make sure that you have a way to not confuse compliance with compatibility. Because so many of us were raised to be good girls, to be nice, to do the quote-unquote right thing, to not make waves. And so a lot of times it's easy to confuse being compliant, meaning doing what the other person wants you to do to avoid having a conflict, let's say, and actual compatibility. Because to figure out compatibility, whether you're compatible with someone or not, it can only come from a place of truth. It can only come from who you actually are, the things you actually like, what your preferences and your desires are. If not, you end up in these one-sided relationships with people, and the relationships end up being all about that person, where they wanted to live, how many kids they wanted to have, the kind of music they want to listen to, what you watch on TV. And I know, because I've heard from many of you, that you're in relationships with people who basically dominate the relationship, or maybe you're the person who dominates the relationship. I don't know. But either way, boundaries are missing if that's happening. And how is knowing this? Let's talk about that a little bit. How is knowing these things, the differences between preferences, demands, judgments, and non-negotiable deal breakers, how does this have you avoid being involved with a narc or a psychopath? Well, if you assert yourself in a relationship with someone who is very unhealthy, regardless of what they have wrong with them, how they respond or react to your boundaries will be incredibly telling. So I like to tell women in my groups and in my Thrive Hive and everywhere that you want to do this early and often, because it's very painful if you wait to start to be honest with someone once you feel very secure about maybe things they're doing. And some of these things are not don't have to be a big deal, right? We have preferences. So what is a preference? I'm just going to get into this and then we'll get into some steps. But it's liking one alternative over another, right? But learning how to express your preferences early and often with ease and grace, right? And when appropriate, love, depending on who it is. This creates the foundation for more satisfaction in a relationship and more harmony in your life. Because being a silent sufferer, how many out there, I just want to be like, raise your hand if you feel like you're a silent sufferer, where you think, well, I don't want to make a big deal. I don't want to hurt the person's feelings. I don't want them to be offended. Doing a lot of projecting of our own feeling fragile ourselves onto other people, where most of the time people can handle the truth. It's being dishonest or not telling the truth, but then acting out your dissatisfaction that people don't understand what the hell's going on. Right? So if you have a preference, learning to make a simple request early is really helpful. Oh, I would prefer we have Chinese instead of Japanese food, or Mexican instead of this, or I'd prefer to cook instead of doing that, or whatever your preference is. And this isn't to say that every time we make a preference that someone's going to acquiesce to what that is, but how someone responds to you making a simple request will be very telling. Because if it's someone like a narcissist, they want things their way all the time. And you can make a simple request as nice, and you could say it with no charge in your voice, and no matter how carefully you choose your words, some people will see it as a demand. And that is what you need to pay attention to. Having a preference does not make you demanding, as long as you're not saying it as a demand. Would it be okay? Or I would prefer this, or I'd like to make a simple request. There's lots of very easy language that you can use to make a simple request. But why I say to do it early and often in the dating process for sure is because the way someone responds to you making a request will be incredibly telling about them. So you have to have the courage to do it early and often, because it'll be very telling. If the person is going to be a total control freak, you will know this. So doesn't mean, a healthy relationship doesn't mean that every preference you have, the other person is like, yes, I'm, whatever you want, necessarily. Because there's a give and take, right? So example, let's say if you have a teenager who's mowing your lawn, right? Like you have a kid who's a teenager. You could make a simple request. If you're having friends over later in the afternoon, hey, Bobby, can I make a simple request that you mow the lawn earlier rather than later, because my friends are going to be here as of 4 o'clock. Can you have it done before then, please? Now, that doesn't mean that he'll be able to do it, but that is different than a demand. And when it's someone who in our life, if we want to give context, like because my girlfriends are coming over at 4 o'clock, there's nothing wrong with giving context, as long as you're not convincing them that you have a right to make a request, right? As long as you're not badgering, as long as you're not cajoling and nagging, right? I mean, there's all these things that we could be doing, but a simple request is none of those things. So let's move into what a demand is. Now, we may not be aware of it, but a lot of times we might be saying things in a demanding fashion because we're so nervous to actually assert ourselves. So, the dictionary basically says an act of demanding or asking, especially with authority, something claimed, due, or owed, right? So it contains this entitlement, demanding. I find it a very ineffective strategy for fostering cooperation, collaboration, or really getting your preferences or your desires met. Most people don't respond well to demands. And think about it right now. When someone demands something from you or feels entitled, do you want to do it? I gotta say, I don't. I pretty much never do. If that's what's happening, I'm not interested, because it really kicks up my ego, but it also makes me mad, Because the truth is, everything I do in my life is voluntary. I mean, unless you're talking about minor kids, everything else is voluntary. Everything. Every relationship, every person, every interaction is your choice. So entitlement, no, it's not great. But let's think about the kid again with the lawn. So if, get that lawn done now. I don't know. I mean, I'd be nervous. If I had a teenager who responded to that, well, it would tell me that that's how I guess I'd been interacting with them. But it's not really effective, right? Making a simple, sort of reasonable request with clear and concise language, right? Like I said before, will you please mow the lawn sooner than later so that it'll look nice when my pals get here? I would really appreciate it. That definitely inspires more cooperation for sure. But let's talk about judgment, right? Let's talk about judgment and discernment. When we're judging other people about why they're doing what they're doing, we're mostly not correct. It's mostly projection from us. So if we don't make the request, so let's say someone you're dating someone and they're texting you all day, but you don't want to text while you're at work. You can judge them as being insensitive, as having no clue, as being out of touch, as whatever judgment you would like to make, because you're pissed that it's an inconvenience, but also that now you're put in a position. So much of the time we get mad when people don't read our minds about our preferences, about our desires, especially if we haven't said it. Because you might have another person, maybe they dated someone else who super loved texting all day long. Who knows? So the judgment piece is something that really leads us down the wrong path most of the time. So what other people do is basically their side of the street. So let's leave the judgment, right? Unless it impacts you. And this is where a simple request comes in. And you can choose discernment instead of judgment, right? You can choose discernment where you set boundaries. And that's what personal boundaries are all about. So instead of saying the person's an idiot because they text you too often, you make the simple request that they don't, and that you're not doing that. Turn your phone off when you're at work. And it doesn't have to be just in a dating situation. It can be any situation. You have a right. Basically, you are making the rules of your life. And if you're not, then you are being compliant, not to be confused with compatible. You're being compliant with someone else's rules. And you got to think about that. It's your life. And if you're not communicating effectively, what are your preferences, your boundaries, your desires, what you like, what you don't like, how could someone possibly know? And so it really does require us stepping up and speaking up. But let's get to the last most important one that really will give you the power to not get into a relationship with a narcissist or a psychopath or anyone else where it's going to end in some shitstorm of bad stuff, right? Because we don't need that. Is you must know your non-negotiable deal breakers in relationships, in your life, in work, in friendships, all of these things. Like, what is it that you just, that are non-negotiable, right? And since everyone is different and you're so unique, there is no other you in the world, right? DNA-wise, that's a fact, that you have to determine this for yourself. For people who come from alcoholic backgrounds or abusive backgrounds, you have to learn this from someone other than your family of origin, because what you learned wasn't normal. What you learned wasn't healthy. It was normal for you, perhaps, but meaning you have to know what your rights are. Like just your human rights. Like you're allowed to change your mind. You're allowed to say no. You're allowed to express yourself. All of these things that if you grew up in a very dysfunctional home, you probably don't know what those things are. But they really are important to know. How non-negotiable is different is that it's right there in the title. It's non-negotiable. These are things that if someone steps over that boundary, some of them you should express, Some of them you should hopefully not need to, but maybe you should anyway. But all right, so let's talk about what are non-negotiable deal breakers. Physical violence. How about emotional abuse? How about maybe recreational drug use? Maybe drinking every night, having some kind of a shadow addiction that the person is not aware of, or having a real straight up addiction, gambling, something like that. So this doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be only about abuse or something so super dramatic. It can literally be these things that make up life. How you want to live, how you want to spend your time. These can be really important non-negotiable deal breakers. If you are with someone who wants to party all the time, or who goes out every weekend, or who loves to spend all of their free time with their friends, but doesn't carve out any free time to spend alone with you, but that's what you need, that doesn't have to be a crime to be a non-negotiable deal breaker for you. So deciding when we share about these non-negotiable deal breakers, like I said, hopefully you don't have to tell someone that physical abuse is a non-negotiable deal breaker, but if you do, then, or if you feel like you do, then say it. But you will be able to tell, even on the smaller things in the beginning of a relationship, or as you're changing a relationship. Now, this is challenging in a different way. Our non-negotiable deal breakers, what if we did put up with some shit for a period of time? What if we did allow someone to do something, and the healthier we get, the less that's cool with us? Well, then you have to have the conversation that, things have changed. And in the past, let's say you not coming home and not letting me know why you didn't come home, I kind of dealt with that, but I don't want to deal with that anymore. So that's really not okay with me. So I'm going to make a simple request that if you're not going to come home, you let me know why, or whatever it is, even if you're talking to, teenagers or a spouse. And if I don't hear from you, I will lock the door. I will do whatever eventually there has to be consequences for someone breaking boundaries. But only you know what your non-negotiable deal breakers are in relationships. And the way that we get to them is by sharing our preferences and our desires and our likes and our dislikes early on in relationships. And if you're trying to change the dance in a relationship, if it's an established relationship, you can start to share your preferences. It doesn't always have to come out like a criticism of the other person, because it really isn't. It's not about them. It really is about you, what you want, how you want to feel, and how you're willing to live your life, right? Do we want to be compliant, or do we want to build true compatibility in our relationships and be authentically known, authentically seen, authentically heard, which all of those things can only happen if you're willing to be vulnerable enough to speak these personal boundaries into being in your life. And I know that you can do it because I've taught thousands of people to do it. It isn't impossible. But this really is about you valuing yourself enough to want to be known. Don't you think it's important that people actually know who you are? We don't want to blend in with the crowd. We don't want to do what's popular. And maybe when we're younger we do, but hopefully as we become adults in life, we want to make our own unique mark. And the only way to be in a relationship that is healthy is if you are actually 50% of that relationship. And in a relationship with a narcissist or a psychopath or an addict, trust me, you're 50% of that dance, but you are sure as shit not 50%, meaning you are not being considered 50% in that relationship, because there's an identified patient, basically, in a relationship in all three of those scenarios. So, if you liked this episode of the Terri Cole Show, please do me a favor and share it. Just take the link and share it wherever you share your social media stuff. I super appreciate your time. I love that you care about your relationships and about your life and about your own mental health. I'm so privileged and honored to guide you in that way. And keep your eyes open, because Wednesday Wisdom is coming back in August. I believe the 7th is going to be our first session. So there'll be information about that in the post right here. So whether you're listening to this on iTunes, whether you're watching it on YouTube, whether you're on terricole.com, thank you, thank you, thank you. If you are not subscribed to my YouTube channel, please do it. If you have not dropped a positive review on iTunes, please do it. That's what you can do for me. I'm happy to put out a ton of free content, and I would love it if you would be kind enough to take a moment out of your life to do that. I hope you have an amazing week, and as always, take care of you.